Hey everyone, the Social Democrat here, and in my first video, I will be addressing conservative political commentator Ben Shapiro and his arguments against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and hit the bell icon to receive notifications, as I intend to make more videos in the near future. And without further ado, let's get right to it.
The left constantly repeats that government is necessary in order to stop discrimination between private parties. Government does, of course, intervene to stop uses of force between private parties, but you have no right to my services, I have no right to your services. Leftists, however, say that if we don't allow government to intervene in order to force me to serve you, widespread, rampant discrimination will break out. They often cite Jim Crow in defense of this notion. That's nonsense. Segregation was governmentally imposed, not socially imposed. It was the government ensuring that those who would not abide by social racism would be forced to do so.
Shapiro's main thesis is that segregation was imposed by the government rather than society writ large, as if to suggest these two claims are somehow mutually exclusive. However, one of the very examples he uses to illustrate his point actually contradicts his claims.
From the 1880s into the 1960s, the majority of American states enforced some form of segregation through what were known as Jim Crow laws. The bottom line is that racists cannot trust free markets to racially discriminate. Racists need the force of government to have success. Two famous examples show how true this is. In February 1960, 4 black students in Greensboro, North Carolina, sat down at the counter at Woolworth's, a segregated restaurant. This was 4 years before the Civil Rights Act forcibly integrated restaurants. The students who sat down at the counter led a boycott against Woolworth's. By July 1960, Woolworth's lunch counter desegregated itself after losing $200,000. The market worked.
As Shapiro said, the Woolworth retail chain ended its segregationist policies after civil rights activists led a boycott against it. That means Woolworth did in fact end the policy of its own volition, but it also means that it started the policy of its own volition, not because of any law. If Woolworth segregated its facilities because it was legally required to, it wouldn't have had the option to desegregate regardless of how much money it lost. Woolworth was just one of many companies that instituted their own policies enforcing segregation independent of any legislation, even a century after the Civil War, and many of them still had such policies in place prior to the passage of the Civil Rights Act. If markets are so effective at fighting discrimination, why did a large retail chain engage in discrimination so long after emancipation? Is Shapiro arguing that 9.5 decades is a suitable wait time for market forces to resolve social problems? Would he consider that acceptable if it took the government that long? Another problem with Shapiro's argument is that he never bothers to explain why Jim Crow laws existed in the first place. Politicians instituted Jim Crow laws because they had widespread public support. This is a very easy thing to prove. All one needs to do is look up Gallup Polls conducted during the Civil Rights era on the topic of segregation. In 1957, only 27% of Southerners approved of any segregation in cases of public transportation and public waiting rooms. 60% of Americans in general did. In 1965, 72% of Southern whites approved of laws forbidding interracial marriage. From 1954 through 1961, opposition to the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling, which led to the end of school segregation, fluctuated between 31 to 44%. Note that the last statistic is for the country as a whole, regardless of race. It's very likely a majority of Southern whites opposed the Brown ruling during much of that time period, given the trends of polling at the time. It took me less than 10 minutes to find these polls, research one would think Shapiro would have taken the time to do himself before making these claims. Given the level of public support that existed in favor of segregation at the time, I see no reason to believe that segregation would have ended anytime soon due to free market forces. I should also note that Shapiro glosses over many pertinent details of the Greensboro sit-in that don't fit with his free market narrative. First of all, the Greensboro sit-in was just that, a sit-in. It was a disruptive action where black students took up space on private property against the wishes of the owners to demand equal treatment. This inspired sit-ins across the United States. In other words, civil rights activists didn't just boycott, they deliberately disrupted the regular business activities of Woolworth and other private companies. They were giving businesses an ultimatum. Service as equals, or not only will we take our money elsewhere, you won't be serving anyone at all. Does this sound like something Shapiro, someone who supports the interests of bigoted property owners over minorities, would advocate?
As black economist Walter Williams states, quote, Whenever there is a law on the books, one's immediate suspicion should be that the law is there because not everyone would behave according to the law's specifications. In other words, you wouldn't need a law forcing people to eat because everybody eats. But the South did need laws forcing people to racially discriminate because many people didn't want to racially discriminate. Free markets only care about one color, green.
There are several points I want to make about this clip here. First off, notice that Shapiro is implying here that because the person he is quoting is black, we should take his views especially seriously on the topic of segregation. We know Shapiro wants us to know that the economist is black because he goes out of his way to mention his race, and if that's not enough, he shows us a drawn image of him. It's a form of tokenism that members of the political right often engage in, to use minorities who hold contrarian views as political props to support their arguments. But one has to ask, why should the view of a minority who holds a view that is unpopular among others in his group be given special consideration? Why should I be impressed that Shapiro was able to find a black guy who agrees with his ahistorical perspective of black people's marginalization by American society in the civil rights era? Second, Shapiro is trying to imply that because Walter Williams is an economist, we should take his views on the matter as authoritative, but they're not. This is because Shapiro isn't even making an economic argument. Sure, he presents his views as an economic matter, but in this video he doesn't actually reference much in the way of economic theory. Instead, he relies mostly on a skewed and extremely biased interpretation of history to support his views. So, not only are Shapiro's claims false, he doesn't even seem to understand that his video relies much more on his ahistorical interpretation of the civil rights era than any economic analysis regarding human behavior in an open market. The third point I want to address is the direct quote by Walter Williams himself. I'll repeat it here. Quote, "Whenever there is a law on the books, one's immediate suspicion should be that the law is there because not everyone would behave according to the law's specifications." This statement is a truism. Clearly not everyone in American society believed that discrimination against minorities was moral. The polls I cited demonstrate as much. So the claim Shapiro and Walter Williams are trying to make here isn't even in dispute. But not everyone had to agree with segregation for the practice to be socially enforceable on a large scale. Shapiro's argument rests on the assumption that somehow proving that not everyone supported discrimination is proof that widespread discrimination would not occur absent government enforcement, but that's not sufficient. He would have to demonstrate that the vast majority of Americans would not engage in discrimination, and he never even attempts to do that. Shapiro sets up an absurdly low bar of evidence to support his conclusions, and gives himself a pat on the back for surpassing it. But keep in mind, more than half of Southern whites supported segregation in some form or another. So it's safe to say, absent government intervention, discrimination would still have been rampant. Lastly, I want to address Shapiro's point at the end of the clip that all markets care about is green, because this is a common free market fundamentalist talking point in respect to discrimination. Just imagine yourself as a business owner in the South during the civil rights era, an era where most of the white population believes in the inherent superiority of their own race and the segregation of their kind from blacks. Do you think you could just treat blacks and whites as equals without consequences? You think a white man is going to let you pay a black man more just because the black man has seniority or because he knows how to do the job better? You think you could put a black person in a position of authority over a mostly white workforce and expect them to command the same level of respect from people who think that they're better? You think you can let blacks and whites eat at the same counters, use the same restrooms, operate at the same workstations? If so, you probably wouldn't have been in business for very long. Shapiro is right. Markets do generally care only about the green, but that's not true for individual citizens. And because that was the case, it was in the interest of businesses to cater to the demands and expectations of the white majority, who held all the economic and political power in the South, even in lieu of direct government enforcement, as Woolworth did. Contrary to what Shapiro suggests, Woolworth's decision to have discriminatory policies in place was a financially sound one right up until civil rights activists decided to start an organized boycott against them. Many businesses didn't want to discriminate, but they felt they had no choice but to do so in order to cater to the demands of the society that they operated in.
During World War II, somebody wanted to sell arms to the Germans. That was cool, right?
That's a national security threat and was illegal for a reason. That's not freedom of association.
Oh, so but what now we have qualifications? Okay.
No. It's called an externality to a relationship. There are no externalities to a relationship where you come into my business and I say I'm not serving you. It's you and me, and a consensual transaction has not taken place. If I sell you a nuclear weapon, there are probably going to be ramifications to me selling you a nuclear weapon.
If no transaction has taken place, there may very well be no externalities, but that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences to discrimination. In the case of discrimination, when one population has virtually all the economic power and systemically restricts another population's access to the economy, the widespread implications should be obvious. A permanent disadvantaged underclass. That is what large-scale discrimination across multiple market sectors necessarily entails, and in fact did in the case of the United States, because keep in mind, discrimination was not just about how a store would serve you or whether a store would serve you at all. It was housing discrimination that dictated where blacks could live. It was discrimination regarding the access and interest rates on loans. It was discrimination regarding what jobs blacks could have, what schools they could go to, how much they were paid, etc. Also, Shapiro's own reasoning can be used against him here. It is in the public interest not to allow rampant discrimination, even if it requires government enforcement. Even the interest of the oppressed group aside, the resentment of an oppressed minority could cause widespread social instability, as demonstrated with the sectarian violence that occurs between the Sunnis, Shiites, and Kurds in much of the Middle East. Discrimination is just as much a security risk as widespread distribution of nuclear weapons. It does affect other people. It affects entire countries, in some cases devolving into civil war. In fact, we did fight a civil war over oppression of a minority group in the United States. History is littered with wars, conflicts, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and numerous other tragedies that were the product of widespread discrimination against racial, religious, and ethnic minorities. As a Jew, Shapiro would know, the Holocaust is a perfect example of what you get when you allow the expression of bigotry and intolerance in a society free of consequences. So, how could discrimination not be considered a national security issue, or otherwise a matter of public interest? By making race discrimination illegal in the private sector, the government said that this is not okay, and that does have an impact on public opinion. The number of whites who openly supported racist policies has gone down dramatically, when nearly half of whites supported racist policies even a century after the Civil War. Thank you for watching this video. As I mentioned earlier, I do intend to create more videos, including ones responding to other arguments Ben Shapiro has made. So if you enjoyed this one, please subscribe and hit the bell icon for notifications for when those videos come out.